Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at Gigabyte's lowest of the low. Well, actually, I think this is their GIMP, why do you have to be so difficult? There we go, much better. And oh, now it's broken again. Indeed, why does it have to be so difficult? Anyway, so we are looking at the X570 Gaming X from Gigabyte, which as far as I know is their lowest end X570 motherboard. This is as cheap as it gets and as badly featured as it gets. So, let's get right into it, shall we? The first, there's no real, there's no dual BIOS. It's a single BIOS board. You do get a Q flash over here, so you can flash the motherboard without having a CPU installed, which is great if you need to update the BIOS for a new CPU that isn't yet supported by the motherboard and you don't have an older CPU that does work. But it's an X570 motherboard, so that's kind of a hard scenario to come by, in my opinion. Like that, this is one feature. Like Q flash is one of those features which is like I don't know why people make such a big deal out of it, because most of the a lot of the time I just buy a newer board, or if you already have a board and a CPU, then it's like, well, you can already update the BIOS, right? So it's only useful if you bought like an X470 motherboard and then a Ryzen 3000 CPU. Right? Because then you need to update the BIOS and the new CPU doesn't work in the board. But this is an X570 board, so that's not really a scenario you're going to run into until maybe next year, right? So, yeah. Anyway, so you do have Q flash. There is unfortunately not even the basic little troubleshooting LEDs, which would tell you like memory error, CPU error, boot media error, GPU error. I can't even find those on this board. Normally they'd be somewhere in this area, but there's nothing. Not for lack of space. Like this board has plenty of space for that kind of thing. It's just, yeah, it's not on here. And as I said earlier, it is also single BIOS. You do get a clear CMOS jumper over there. So yeah, this is the low, it's a low end board. There's basically nothing on it. No dual BIOS, no troubleshooting LEDs, no anything. But is the VRM any good? And in that department, I can say yes. And also, this is one of those motherboards, one of the few X570 motherboards which has a reasonable power connector configuration, which is of course the single 8-pin. This is more than enough for a 16 core, as that can handle 384 watts in its worst configuration, and the 16 core will not pull that much power either. So, yeah. Nothing to complain about here with the single 8-pin. Anyway, so let's take a look at the VRM. Now, the VRM here is actually, I think, Gigabyte used the same VRM on Z390, but I don't think I actually reviewed the board I don't think I covered that board which uses this VRM, but it is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 phase for your V-core, and a 2-phase for your SoC over here. It is controlled by this chip over here, which is an ISL 69147, which is a 7-phase controller. And this is a new, 7-phase controller from ISL from Intersil for AMD CPUs. Here it is running configured as a 5+2, and then on the back of the board we find a whole bunch of doublers. So now we're on the back of the board, and I of course broke GIMP because GIMP is stupid. I really don't know where that bug comes from. But anyway, so we have one doubler over here, another over there, another over here, another here, and one more there. Those are all ISL 6617s. Which can do they can run both phases in ASUS mode, where they don't actually do any doubling at all. They can do current balancing with interleaving. They can do current balancing. They can do interleaving with no current balancing. They're kind of some of the smarter doublers that you can get out there. So they're pretty cool. But depends how Gigabyte has them configured here. But the cool thing is that they do actually monitor the current going through each phase and add it up and then report that to the voltage controller. And that's why they can also do the current balancing, because they can, if they're configured to do that, they can actually choose to put more load on the less loaded phase, which in theory should get you better efficiency, as you'll have the current shared across all the phases much more evenly. So, yeah, ISL 6617, as far as doublers go, I don't really think there's a better option out there. Then for the drivers, we have a bunch of ISL 6625s. And there's, of course, one for each phase, which is how we know that, each phase can be independently driven. The SoC VRM, I'm actually not sure what's going on with this chip, because that is not, that's not an ISL, like, this chip right here, that is not an ISL 6617, so I assume it's some kind of dual driver from Intercell, but I don't know what that chip actually is. But still, this chip, this supports +2, so this isn't a single phase, because if it was a single phase, you could drive it with, like, just one of the 6625s, which, actually, the GIMP, you being stupid. Just looking at that. Wait a minute. There's a... GIMP, you stupid pile of trash. There's a chip hiding over here. So maybe this is driver for that, and then this is driver for this. That would make a lot of sense. Because otherwise there's kind of too many chips sitting over here. Yeah. Anyway... So for the actual MOSFETs, we do have a bunch of discrete MOSFETs, and they're, of course, the ever so popular with low-end motherboards. For the high side, we have none other than the 4C10N from On Semiconductor, which I've given this MOSFET a ton of flack because, well, it's kind of slow. It's relatively high RDS on. It's really not that great. And it is a staple of low-end motherboards. But the thing is, okay, see, the thing is, if you have a lot of phases and you can use relatively, not so great MOSFETs and still get pretty decent efficiency across the current output range that you need for something like the Ryzen, even like the Ryzen 12 core or the 16 core. So if we look at the back of the board, well, actually, we shouldn't be on the back yet. Let's stay on the front. Oh, so I can also just click here. I just can't. GIMP, you're so stupid. Anyway, but we have, on this side, it looks like, so you have one high side MOSFET, you have one low side MOSFET, right? So low, high, and the low side is, we'll put it over here. That's a 4C06N, which, here's the thing. These MOSFETs are no different than what you would find on, like, Gigabyte's B450 or X470 motherboards. It's just that there's so many more of them here. On the previous Gigabyte boards, there was, like, you had 8 4C06s, and depending on the model, you'd have 4 or 8 4C10Ns, and that would be like a 4-phase VRM. This here is a 10-phase. We have all the doublers. The ISL does 5, right? So we have a 10-phase. So we have 10 high-side MOSFETs. So right off the bat, we've got +2 high-side MOSFETs, even over the best X470 configuration. But with the 4C06s, if you look at the back of the board, we get... Oh, damn it, GIMP. Okay, let's go over there. We've got a second one on the back. So that's another 4C06. So each phase is 4C06 times 2, and then a 4C10N as well. And the end result, like the main complaint I have for a 4C06 as a low side MOSFET is that it's 4 milliohms RDS on. That's not really a problem when you have 10 phases of them with 2 in each phase, because if you do one 4C06 plus another 4C06, then because they're in parallel, you actually just cut that in half and you get 2 milliohms RDS on. And that's actually fine. That's actually pretty damn good. So, the overall efficiency of this VRM, assuming the... Oh, wait, I need to do the GIMP thing. There we go. So, the efficiency of this VRM is actually really not bad, even though it's made of what, you might consider pretty subpar components just about freaking everywhere. So, 1.2 volts out, which is the voltage I've been using for the X570 motherboard comparisons so far. 300 kilohertz switching frequency. Like, the thing is, if we go from 1.2 volts to like 1.4 volts, generally that's going to only increase the heat output by about 10%. So if you were producing 20 watts at 1.2 volts, you produce 22 at 1.4 volts. Doesn't make a huge difference, right? So same current draw, but higher voltage, you're going to produce 10% more heat, generally. So 300 kilohertz switching frequency and 12 volts gate to source voltage because, well, the drivers support that, and that's the best. Like that's like if you run these off of 5 volts, then they suck even. Like they start sucking again. So I'm gonna assume that they're running them straight 12 volts because the drivers support that, and the motherboard has a 12 volt. Like you can grab 12 volts here, you can grab 12 volts there. Right, there's no shortage of 12 volt rails. So I don't see why you'd run 5 volts if the MOSFETs are fine with it. Anyway, so assuming these operating parameters, 100 amps output, this VRM is going to be producing about 10.5 watts of heat from the MOSFETs. That does not include inductor losses, and it does not include driver losses. The reason why I'm mentioning the driver losses is that they do exist, and if I'm doing a VRM with a bunch of power stages will just directly include the driver losses as part of their heat output. But for discrete MOSFETs, I don't, for convenience reasons, because generally the driver losses are going to be like, 1, maybe 2 watts, depending on the drivers, for the whole VRM, not like per phase. For the whole VRM, it would add maybe a watt or 2 of extra heat dissipation that just kind of stays there all the way down to like even 5 amps output or something, because your driver loss doesn't really go away as long as the whole VRM is running. So why I'm pointing that out is that if I'm doing a VRM full of discrete MOSFETs, since I don't include the driver losses, these look a bit more efficient at low currents than they should, because at, like say at 100 amps output, well, 1 watt more heat from the drivers would make this 11.5 watts, and that's a pretty significant difference in your overall efficiency than if at 200 amps you're producing 20 watts and you do plus 1 watt to that, right? Like it's 5% instead of like 10% here of your overall heat output. So here it has more impact on the efficiency, and it makes, at low currents, it makes the VRM look a bit better because it's a small bit of extra heat, and the less heat the MOSFETs themselves produce, the bigger a factor it becomes, right? So, but the thing is, it's also just, it doesn't really change, so I don't include it because it's not that important, because it is just 1 watt, right? So anyway, going up to 150 amps. So for 100 amps, that 10.5 watts of heat, that's fine. That's actually really, like compared to a lot of X470 motherboards, this is actually blowing them right out of the water. Low-end X470, low-end B450 doesn't even begin to compare to this. I really hope that Gigabyte just takes this VRM, and if for B550, which is eventually coming, and I don't know when, but when B550 comes out, I really hope they just take this VRM and keep using it. They might even be like, I wouldn't even mind if they knocked 1 or 2 phases off, like as long as they don't drop the 2 low sides per phase. That's really helpful as far as I'm concerned here, because it effectively gives you, like, even if this was an 8-phase instead of a 10-phase like we have here, you'd still have, 16 low side MOSFETs, which is just so much better than having what like the old X470 Gaming Ultra had. That had 8, right? Like you literally have half the RDS on because you have twice as many low side MOSFETs. So, and that's super important at high current outputs, because your low side MOSFET handles something like 80 to 90% of the current going through the VRM goes through the low side MOSFET. So if you have a very if your low side MOSFETs are very high resistance, you lose a ton of power at high current outputs to that resistance. So yeah, like this is a, you can use cheap MOSFETs. You just have to use a lot of them to compensate for their general crappiness, right? 1 4C06, not so great. 2 of them, much better. The thing is, you can also just buy MOSFETs that are like the equivalent resistance of 2 4C06s in a single package, right? Which is like, if you were looking at a design that's supposed to be more compact, like a lot of GPUs will have a low side MOSFET that's like 1.4 milliohms, and it's a single chip, and it's even smaller than this, right? And the reason, and so like you might be wondering, well, why don't more motherboards use really nice low side MOSFETs like that? Well, these are dirt cheap, and they're often, like, the thing is, you'll often use these MOSFETs everywhere. Like you need to make a cheap 4-phase, you'll just use less of these. You need to make a bigger, better 4-phase, you use more of these, right? You can buy a few hundred, like you can buy a ton of these in bulk, and you don't have a bunch of different parts that you need to use for all of your designs, because you can just put these ones in parallel. This memory VRM is built up of more of the same. The chipset VRMs are probably more of the same. We can't actually see them because they're hiding under the heatsink, but yeah, that looks like more of the same. And GIMP is being stupid again. Why can't you just be normal? There we go. Oh, and now it's broken again. So yeah, it's like, this works. Like if you just put a bunch of them in parallel, that works out great. Anyway, 150 amps output. We're going to be looking at about 18.5 watts of heat, which, you know, is not great. There's definitely motherboards out there on X570 which have much better efficiency at 150 amps output. But at the same time, what did I want to say? Like that's not disaster zone. Like you could totally, like, especially depending on the heatsink, and Gigabyte is going with a, like, I'm not really a fan of the plastic IO cover because I think they should have just gone with a heatsink that just goes like all the way to the IO, and that would just have way more surface area, but they do still have a heatsink that's relatively large and relatively high surface area. And it's also not handling, like, because you do have two phases that are actually on the top heatsink up here. I think they could have maybe shuffled the VRM around a little bit to get like more of the phases up onto the top heatsink. But then they also have the well, no, the SoC is not gonna, like, this VRM has to handle like 10 to 20 amps at most. So this one doesn't need to do anything compared to these. Yeah, so it really comes down to the heatsink. 18.5 watts, though, is really not like the end of the world as far as heat output goes, especially since that's not 18.5 watts right here. That's going to be like 15 here, and then you're going to have 3.5-ish there, right? Like a bit of that's going to be sitting on these two phases up there. So that's going to be fine. It's going to work out okay. But it's also not the most efficient, right? There's, of course, motherboards that do 150 amps at like 15 watts of heat or even lower, because they use better components. So going up to 200 amps, at this point, the VRM starts getting a bit of a workout. It'll produce about 29 watts of heat. And this is where it really depends on the heatsink design. I'm just not sure. I think the plastic IO cover here might act as a bit of an airflow restrictor, especially like this ledge right here. Yeah, I'm not really a fan. Also, the fact that, like, if you have a fin that goes into there, then obviously, you know, how are you going to get air to flow through that IO cover? Where is it going to enter? It can't enter through here. It can't exit up there. So the efficiency of this heatsink is going to be kind of like, it's really going to come down to the efficiency of the heatsink. And I'm not really a fan of what Gigabyte's done with the GIMP. Why can't you just stop doing that? Like, what they're doing with the design doesn't really seem to like be like, they don't seem to be focusing on best thermal management. But also it's worth noting that this 200 amps output figure is like 16 core Prime 95. So let's just go P95 AVX. Okay, that's not playing a game on the 16 core. That's not even like Cinebench. Like Cinebench pulls less power than Prime 95 does. So even like a lot of rendering workloads will not pull as much power as something like Prime 95. There are also workloads that will pull as much power as Prime 95. It's just that you'd be looking at like video encoding with like heavy AVX acceleration for something like that. And so, you know, this is a scenario that the board kind of isn't meant for, and it could maybe still even handle it. Okay. Also, if Gigabyte gives us switching frequency controls, you could maybe underclock the VRM a little bit. So from like 300 kilohertz down to 200 kilohertz. And, you know, it might still, like, you might get a bit more efficiency, and it might still work out in terms of your voltage regulation to be just fine. And you can potentially reduce the heat output a bit. So yeah, 200 amps is a kind of borderline. At the same time, again, it's also not 29 watts being dumped right here, right? It's most of the 29 watts, and then like, what is it? I mean, it's a 10 watt. It's like, yeah, you're going to have like 23, 24 watts here, and then like 6 watts up there. The heatsink up there should handle 6 watts just fine. The heatsink over here, 24 watts. Yeah, actually, that tends to be around where like, not even the great, like, not even well-designed VRM heatsinks can just about do 24 watts. So depending on your case airflow, this should also be fine. And it's really not something that, like, it's a pretty extreme workload, not something the motherboard's really meant for, right? This is the cheapest X570 board. And for the 12 core, I think it would be great, because the 12 core is around this output in terms of current. So yeah, that's something that's kind of like, so I'm okay with this VRM design. I think it could have still been, you know, potentially more optimized. It also, like, the other thing is the MOSFETs on the back are a potential thermal issue because you only have heat sinking on one side of the board. Or actually, well, no, I think they have a heatsink, like a heatsink backplate on the board as well, which is currently not installed because obviously we can see the VRM. But yeah, like at 200 amps output, it really comes down to the cooling system. At 150 amps output, this VRM should be just fine. So great for the 12 core. 16 core really depends. There's other boards that actually put out as much current as much heat at 200 amps for X5. Like there's other X570 boards that basically have the same VRM efficiency or worse, where, you know, again, it also just comes down to how the cooling system is done, because you can offset some, like, you know, if you make the heatsink big enough, you can take care of your inefficient VRM just fine, right? It's always an option. You don't need to have the most efficient VRM if you have a big enough cooling system. So anyway, going past that to things that are more purely theoretical, like, I don't know, you had the dumb idea to run this motherboard on liquid nitrogen for some reason. 250 amps, the VRM is going to produce 41 watts of heat. That's a no. That's not going to work very well. And then 300 amps output, you're going to be looking at about 55 watts of heat, which is more so a problem, right? Like at this point, this is not going to work. Like 55 watts of heat. Like if you have a big enough heatsink and a good amount of airflow, yeah, you can take care of that. The heatsink design on this motherboard, not built for that. Also, a good chunk of that heat is on the back of the board. Which is potentially a major issue, right? So yeah, that's kind of the thing about putting your low side MOSFETs on the back of the board. Like they do save you a lot of space, right? Like if they put the low side MOSFETs on this side of the board, then you'd have to like move, like basically the amount of space this takes up right here would be doubled. Right, so it would end up going to like down to there or something. Or you can, there's a few different ways you can lay out the VRM. So there's like some really cramped layouts that you can do where you'd go like a lot of GPUs will go high, low. Well, actually, no, they'll do something that looks like high. Okay, wait, let's just say we took these three phases right here. So you could do it's like a high, high, low, and then you do low, low, and then you do low, low. And you basically have like, you have a phase that looks like this, right? And then you have another phase that looks like that. And essentially you could, and then you could squish it together a bit, and that kind of works out. And there's a lot of GPUs that do that because, you know, you don't want to have a super long GPU PCB. But obviously for a motherboard, like, well, that would still potentially not be optimal for the space savings, right? So yeah, the MOSFETs on the back, they help in terms of your VRM efficiency. They're just kind of a cooling problem, because how do you get them, how do you cool them is a pretty difficult issue to solve as far as I'm concerned, especially once you start pushing a lot of heat, right? Otherwise, like at lower heat outputs, as long as this side of the VRM, like the side where the heatsink is cool enough, the back of the board can just sink heat through the PCB and up to the side with the heatsink. But if this side is already, like, if this side is at 100 degrees, then the back of the board is going to be significantly hotter than 100, right? So that's kind of the main concern, is just, like, you basically need to have better cooling if your MOSFETs are on the back of the board, so that the top side is cool enough that heat from the back side can get to the top side more easily. But anyway, for lower current outputs, it's going to be fine. At high current outputs, I mean, this VRM is not really meant for that. Also, these are purely theoretical. It's just kind of like, well, what if you did want to do that? Well, this is not how you would do that. That kind of thing. SoC VRM, we're looking at actually two high sides, two low sides. So you have high, right? And so that's the phases themselves. Then on the back of the board, we have another high side, another high side, and another low side, and another low side, and then the phases are split like that. So yeah, that's what's going on with the SoC VRM. For memory power, we just have a single phase, the standard Gigabyte single phase. They use this VRM all the way from like this board to the X570 Extreme. So I'm cool with this. Like this single phase memory power. Well, the other thing is, I think Gigabyte just doesn't care as much about being the best at memory overclocking as, say, like MSI or Asus do, or well, I don't think ASRock cares about memory overclocking on Intel, is the feeling I get with ASRock boards, because on Intel, their boards are really quite impressive. On AMD, my experience has been subpar, to say the least. So anyway, this is a single phase, and it's the bog standard, RT8120 from Richtech for the controllers, and then we have a high side, two low sides. So not the most efficient VDDR power, not the most powerful VDDR power, not even necessarily the cleanest, but it does the job. It's not like it works. Like it works. Well, for the Z390 Aorus Master has the same VRM, and on the Z390 Aorus Master, the memory overclocking is quite good, especially when you're running like 4x8 DIMM configurations, because the T topology on that board works really well for that. But here with this board, we are actually looking at a daisy chain, which biases towards 2 DIMM configurations, which I think, like, for a board in this, in this price class, that makes perfect sense. So we can actually, yeah, can we see it? Yes, we can. Yeah, see? Trace comes in, hits this pin, goes around, hits that pin, and that's a daisy chain. So that's what's going on here. So it biases towards this DIMM slot and this DIMM slot, because, and somebody's going to be like, I've had somebody ask me, like, wait, Buildzoid, why doesn't it bias towards the DIMM slot closer to the memory slot, to the CPU socket? Because then you, like, if you put a DIMM on here, you got all of this wire hanging off unterminated, and it just causes a whole bunch of signal integrity issues. Don't ask me why. That's, like, beyond my understanding. It's just like, that's the answer I got, is like, daisy chain has if you put your DIMM here, this causes issues. This causes like ringing issues and all kinds of signal integrity problems. If you put your DIMM here, then everything's fine because it's terminated. And the amount of wire, like, technically speaking, the pin of the DIMM slot in a daisy chain is actually a problem. Like, because, it's a little bit of wire just sticking out of the board, and it's not terminated, but at least it's not this much wire. Like, it's significantly less wire, so it's less of a problem. So yeah, we are looking at a daisy chain layout on this motherboard, so it should work really well with like a 2x8 configuration. And then for 2x16, really depends on the BIOS. Okay, like the once you start looking at dual rank multi-rank memory configurations, it's not just about the DIMMs you use, it's also how the motherboard handles how the BIOS handles the DIMMs you use. And you can run into things where like 2x16, depending on the BIOS, will clock the same as 4x8. Or just because 4x8 is better optimized in terms of the DIMM, like in terms of the actual memory sticks, and it's better supported from the memory stick side than 2x16. But we're also going to start seeing 16 gigabit ICs pretty soon. Actually, you can already... Oops. Okay, this time it's not GIMP's fault, it's mine. 16 gigabit ICs are coming out, so we might start seeing single rank 2x16, but then it's like, well, do the ICs suck? There's a chance that 16 gigabit memory chips will just not do more than 4,000 megahertz or something, or more than 3,200, right? Like, fun fact, 4 gigabit AFR from Hynix is better than 8 gigabit AFR from Hynix, even though 8 gigabit AFR is newer than 4 gigabit AFR. So yeah, just because the memory chip is new does not mean the memory chip is good, because the memory vendors ultimately only care about hitting JEDEC spec, and JEDEC spec goes up to 3,200 megahertz. Anything past that is a kind of is an added bonus. But the priority for Samsung, Micron, Hynix, there's one more, there's two more. Why can't I remember? Nanya, and all of these different memory vendors is basically the memory has to be cheap to produce, and it has to go 2133 to 3200. That's all they really care about. It's cheap to produce as possible, and it has to go up to 3200. 3200 is actually kind of optional. It's like it just has to run the speeds that like Intel servers use, right? Because that's their primary consumer of memory is big Intel server farms. So Intel server farms run 2666. Well, it doesn't make sense to make RAM that goes faster than 2066 if it costs more to make that kind of memory. So yeah. Anyway, kind of went off track there. Board's a daisy chain. It will really so at least it should bias towards 2 DIMM configurations, but ultimately it'll depend on testing the board out when it hits retail. But the thing is like daisy chain on like X470, even on cheap or even B450. Cheap B450 and X470 daisy chains can already do on 2 DIMM configurations, can easily do like 3600 plus. That's not a problem. So at least for 2x8, it should work really well. For higher density configurations, depends on too many different factors, right? Because you can do 32 gigs of B die, and that's when you're looking at dual rank, and then it's like, well, does the BIOS play well with that? And then you have things like, oh, you could maybe do, I think 16 gigabit is A die from Samsung coming out soon, or already available if you're buying like Samsung OEM sticks. And those are, I don't know. Like, I don't know how those clock. I've heard some really awful things about them, but that might just be down to the fact that Samsung OEM sticks generally suck. So, yeah, we might have to see the big memory vendors like Corsair, G-Skill, Team Group actually bin those chips into something that's usable. And, you know, so far I've not seen anything, seen too much about that. So, yeah, that's basically everything I wanted to talk about on this board, I think. Yep, that covers everything. So, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd, what else? How did I forget my outro? Whatever. If you'd like to support the channel, I'm just going to assume that I covered everything. So yeah, if you'd like to support the channel, I have a Patreon, so you can support me directly through that. And there's also the AHOC Teespring if you want to, you know, buy like AHOC shirts, stickers, posters, socks. There's even hoodies now if you want those. And yeah, so those all help out with running the channel immensely. And the one last thing I forgot to mention is that I did get this picture of this motherboard from Gigabyte, so thanks to them for providing images. Though I assume the main reason why they give me images of their motherboards is because they've just they've done like a 180 on their VRM designs since B450 and X470. So it's just like, look, our VRMs are good now, BuildZoid, acknowledge it. It's like, yes, it's a lot better. It's actually even pretty good. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.